When it comes to Pulp Fiction or any movie of true substance, we're always going to be dealing with deeper themes than what we see on the surface. And in the world of art, people usually call this subtext. So what is this movie actually saying? So now we've covered the performances in this film in a previous video, and we've also talked about how this movie is built in terms of, the camera, the editing, the script. The links for both of these videos are in the description below. But this video is the one I've been looking forward to the most in terms of covering Pulp Fiction, because from where I'm sitting, there are 4 overarching themes in this movie: consequence without judgment, attention and its outcomes, people shift, they don't reverse, and why there's always a king. So let's unpack these one at a time, and then we're going to bring it all together. Theme number 1, consequence without judgment. So I think all human beings have an innate sense of what's right and wrong, and also what's fair. So if you have 2 little kids and you give one of them a piece of candy but withhold the candy from the other, you're going to see immediately that the kid who did not get the candy will feel that an injustice has been done. And no one ever really taught them that. This kid hasn't read philosophy, but he just knows in his heart that something's wrong. And if you extrapolate that idea, then you realize that the sense of fairness isn't necessarily something we learn. It's something we arrive with. Now, naturally, every filmmaker is going to bring their own views, their ideas, and beliefs into any artistic endeavor. And sometimes you can see it as clear as day that there's a moral viewpoint of the film. The music will tell you, the lighting will tell you, a character will turn to camera and explain the lessons of the film. But Pulp Fiction feels very unique in this way because the film behaves almost like an observer. We're all watching this action and consequence. And here's why that works and why it hits harder than the alternative. Because we already have this sense. The film doesn't need to supply it. Tarantino can afford to be neutral because the audience already has this innate knowledge. He shows you Vincent dying in that dingy bathtub, but then we as the audience supply the verdict ourselves. And that lands harder than any film that tells you what to think. All actions have consequences. We are not here to judge people, we're just here to observe them. This picture shows you, if A, then B. It's not saying, oh, you shouldn't do coke. It's saying, no, if you do coke constantly, something bad is going to happen to you. And then this rule set, well, it scales up. It can be as pedestrian as eating Cocoa Puffs for breakfast every morning and then having a heart attack at age 50. Or it can be as big as you're a hitman, you were given a second chance, but you didn't take it on board, and so you die. This is really the same rule, but it's just at a different scale. And we said the same thing about Goodfellas. So that film doesn't really lay judgment either. It just shows you the road and where it goes. So if you look at the evidence, we have 5 people, 5 outcomes, and 0 commentary. Mia does something careless, not evil, but careless. She doesn't ask, she doesn't check. She ends up with a nosebleed, vomit, and then a needle in her chest. But she lives. Vincent is the decent one in the house that evening. He behaves himself, he doesn't dump her at a hospital and drive away. He puts the needle in her chest himself, but he dies in that bathroom. Butch, he beats a man to death, and he says he doesn't feel the least bit bad about it. But then he turns around and he goes back for a man who wants him killed. He gets his watch, he gets the money, the girl, and his life. Marsellus loses his temper, and then he gets in a shootout in the middle of the street. He ends up in a dingy basement having all manner of horrible things done to him. And then we have Pumpkin and Honey Bunny. No masks, no plan. Their face is shown to an entire room full of witnesses, but they end up walking out with a bag full of wallets and the money from the register. So we got 5 people, 5 outcomes, and the film doesn't say one word about whether any of it was deserved. And the proof isn't just in what happens, it's actually in the order of how this happens. Because if you run the film chronologically in your mind, well, Vincent, then he dies near the end. And in that version, his death is the climax of the movie. It's the payoff. It's the film delivering a verdict. You were careless and here's your punishment. But then this would be a morality tale. And the moment a film becomes a morality tale, well, a lot of times you stop believing it, because now we're just watching any sort of run-of-the-mill type film. But that's not what Pulp Fiction's about. Vincent dies in the middle of the movie in someone else's chapter over a Pop-Tart. Butch puts the gun down and leaves the apartment. Nobody makes a comment about this. And the film ends on a man deciding what the next step in his journey will be, not a man being punished. The order isn't just clever. The order is what stops this being a sermon, which brings me to the 2 men I keep thinking about while I watch this movie. The movie feels less like a course taught by Aristotle and more like something from Isaac Newton. Because Newton wasn't in the business of telling you how to behave, he was describing how things behave. Force, motion, cause and effect. A thing happens, therefore another thing happens. There's no verdict attached. The world of physics is not making a moral judgment. It's just explaining how one input causes a relative output. Aristotle, on the other hand, is the opposite. He's the granddaddy of all of it. His whole project was perspective. He gave us the foundations of deductive reasoning. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And then he applied the same rigor to how a person ought to live. We did touch on this in our episode on election when we talked about eudaimonia, which is the idea of human flourishing, becoming the best version of yourself through reason and discipline and good habits. Aristotle tells you what the good life is and how to build one, but Pulp Fiction won't tell you anything of the sort. And that's why Aristotle is useful here as a point and a counterpoint, because the film is running Aristotle's logic with Aristotle's ethics stripped out of it. If A then B, every time, but never once, and therefore you should. And the film actually explains its own operating system out loud. So in the coffee shop, when Jules gets the drop on Ringo and Honey Bunny, and she's screaming across the room, and he's screaming back at her, trying to get her to calm down, what he actually says is, when you yell at me, it makes me nervous. When I get nervous, I get scared. And when motherfuckers get scared, that's when motherfuckers accidentally get shot. Yelling equals nervous. Nervous equals scared, and scared equals everybody dies. That's the whole film in 3 lines. Nobody in that exchange is talking about right and wrong. What they're talking about is what follows what. But because we're here, we're doing this thing, I'm going to complicate my own argument. Because if the film is truly neutral, then why does the ending feel so satisfying? Why does Vincent's death feel earned if no one's handing down a verdict? Well, I think the answer is the film is neutral, but the world isn't. Tarantino declines to judge anybody, but the world he built applies the consequences with total indifferent consistency, and consistency is its own kind of moral structure. The way I think about it is the physics of the world do the work the sermon would have done in another world. So when you walk out of Pulp Fiction feeling like you've watched something deeply moral, and you can't really pinpoint a single moment where the film told you what to think, well, that's not an accident. That's really the whole trick. It's not judging, it's just observing. Theme number 2, attention and its outcomes. So as I've mentioned before on this channel, I played a bunch of baseball as a kid. And any baseball player will tell you, along with a bunch of other sports fanatics, that hitting a baseball is one of the hardest things to do in the entire world of sports. Now, I could spend a very long time explaining to you how to swing a bat properly, but 1, you're gonna get really bored, and 2, that's not the purpose of this channel. The only reason I bring this up is the very first thing you learn at only 5 years old, before you learn anything else about swinging a bat, is you never take your eye off the ball. That's true in baseball, and it's true in life more generally. If you have spelling mistakes in an essay, well, you might fail a class. If you have spelling mistakes in a Word document at work, you might lose your job. If you're talking to a pretty lady in a bar and your eyes drift to another woman across the room, you're probably not going to have any success with the woman who's standing right in front of you. And if you cross the road without looking, odds are you're going to be in serious trouble. It's the same rule at different scales, the same way the last rule operated. Small stakes, medium stakes, and then the stakes where you don't get to try this again. Because attention isn't something you switch on when you feel like it. It's a prerequisite for a life to have meaning, for a life to have value, and quite often just to stay alive. Which brings us to Vincent Vega. Now here's the thing about Vincent, and this part is really load-bearing for the whole argument. Vincent's not a bad guy. He takes his boss's wife out for the evening, he behaves himself quite well. He even stands in the bathroom giving himself a pep talk in the mirror about loyalty. But then she overdoses and he doesn't run. He could have dumped her at a hospital door, he could have driven off into the night, but instead he crashes his car through his dealer's house and he puts the needle in her chest himself. That's a man doing the right thing at some serious cost to his own life. So he isn't punished for being bad. He's a decent guy, at least in that moment, but he's just not there. Travolta plays this role as muted. That's the way I think of it. It's like an adjustable light that's turned down a little too far, or a radio playing in the background, but it's a little too low. He's never out of control. He's just slightly behind the moment, but he's slightly behind every moment. He isn't coasting through life as much as he's drifting through it. It's almost like he's a passenger in the lives of other people. And then there are the bathrooms. Mia finds heroin in his coat. Vincent's in the bathroom talking to himself in the mirror. Butch walks into his own apartment to get his watch. Vincent's in the bathroom with his paperback. The diner gets robbed. Vincent's in the bathroom with the same paperback. And in the very first job of the film, when the fourth man bursts into the room and he starts firing the gun at Jules and Vincent from only a few feet away, well, that guy comes out of a bathroom. So 4 times, and no one in this film ever mentions it, not one character remarks on it. It's just there. It's in the staging. It's waiting for us as the audience to notice. And at the moment that matters most, when he's actually in the room, he's still not really paying attention. A guy fires 6 rounds at him in a tiny apartment from only a few feet away, and he misses every single one. Jules calls it a miracle. Vincent's read is, we were just lucky. It's a freak occurrence, and there's that story about a thing that he saw in an episode of Cops one night on TV. And then he looks at the dead man on the floor with disgust, and he gets back to work. But just think about that for a moment, because somebody got that close to ending your life. Well, you'd expect any person to just take a moment, just some self-reflection, just give me anything. But Travolta plays it as a man who has none of that in him. And that's not stupidity. He isn't a stupid person. It's that the information arrives and it doesn't land because no one's home to receive it. Now, let's take the other characters and put them next to him, because the film gives you the entire range. Mia isn't paying attention either. She goes through a stranger's coat, she finds a bag of white powder, doesn't even know what it is, and she puts it up her nose without even asking a question. That could have been rat poison. She doesn't know. And she does live, but there's a pretty big cost, and the cost is the needle going into her heart, and, she's nearly dead on this dealer's living room floor. Butch is paying attention, and you can see it in the pawn shop. Some of the decision is moral, and we're going to unpack that. But part of it is just a clear-eyed calculation. A living Marsellus who owes him his life is a Marsellus who calls off the dogs. A dead Marsellus is a crew with no boss and a boxer who's still on their kill list. So Butch works out in this crappy little pawn shop in perhaps the worst 30 seconds of his life, but he works it out correctly. And then we have the wolf. Winston Wolfe arrives at the stranger's house at 8:30 in the morning. And he's got this headless body in the garage. And, he's never surprised once. He sees the deadline, he sees the car, he sees the homeowner, he understands that the wife is due back, and he knows how to deal with the linen closet situation. He handles all of it, and then he goes to breakfast with a young lady. He's the most present human being in the entire picture. And just think about him standing next to Vincent. They're in the same kitchen for about a half hour, and one of them, at least in the chronology of the movie, has about a day to live. And just think about what the film does with all of that. The people who keep their eye on the ball, well, they get the best outcomes. The ones who don't, well, they don't. And once again, it's not because they deserve it. It's not because anyone's handing out rewards and punishments. It's just because that's how the world actually works. Okay, so theme 3 is people shift, they don't reverse. Now, my favorite 2 eras of cinema are the 1970s and the 1990s. The 90s in large part because that's when I grew up and I just love the style and the content of the films from that era. But the 70s because of something else. In large part, it's because in those films, you almost never saw a character undergo a massive change. I've never been a fan of movies where the bad guy who's been mean to everybody turns into a saint in the final reel of the film, and mainly because I don't think that's what happens in the real world. People can change, but it's never like a 180-degree shift. We see these tiny movements, we see pivots, or sometimes we see the person they always were underneath when they've been pretending to be someone else. But these complete changes, it's fake, it's lazy, and it's not how human beings actually function. So anyway, my favorite shift in cinema history is actually in The Godfather. So Vito Corleone's been shot, the entire family's in disarray, and his son Michael, who's the all-American boy, he's a war hero, he's a Marine, he only loves one woman, he's not like his brother sleeping with half of New York City. But anyway, Michael is a man who wanted nothing to do with his family business, but he loves his mom. He loves his dad. He loves his siblings completely. And when his father's nearly killed and Michael's the only competent one of the children left, he's the only one who can really right the ship. And then that's when we get this.
You can't wait. Can't wait. I don't care what Soletso says about a deal. He's gonna kill Pop. That's it. That's the key for him. Gotta get Soletso.
Mike is right. Let me ask you something, Professor. I mean, what about this McCluskey?
Huh?
What do we do with this copy?
They want to have a meeting with me, right? It will be me, McCluskey, and Soletso. Let's set the meeting. Get our informers to find out where it's going to be held. Now, we insist it's a public place, a bar, a restaurant, someplace where there's people so I feel safe. They're going to search me when I first meet them, right? So I can't have a weapon on me then. But if Clemenza can figure a way to have a weapon planted there for me, then I'll kill them both.
Now, if you watch the end of that dolly shot pushing ever so slowly towards Michael, at the end he blinks. It's almost like the closing and opening of his eyes is a baptism that he's putting himself through in real time. This is in the room with all his father's men. But at the outset, that might feel like a 180-degree shift, but it's not. This is a man who's raised in a generational business. So for better or worse, some of what his father did was going to rub off on him. And it's the perfect example of what Trey Parker and Matt Stone from South Park are talking about when they say, and is bad, but or therefore is good.
We've found out this really simple rule that maybe you guys have all heard before, but it took us a long time to learn it. But we can take these beats, which are basically the beats of your outline, and if the words and then belong between those beats, you're f***ed, basically. You got something pretty boring. What should happen between every beat that you've written down is either the word therefore or but. Right? So what I'm saying is that you come up with an idea and it's like, okay, this happens, right? And then this happens. No. It should be this happens and therefore this happens. But this happens, therefore this happens. And that, as soon as we are able to, and literally sometimes we'll write it out to make sure we're doing it. We'll have our beats and we'll say, okay, this happened, but then this happens, and that affects this, and that does to that, and that's why you get a show that feels like, okay, this to that, to this to that, but this, here's the complication, to that.
Because look at what actually happens. Michael was the all-American kid, but his father was nearly killed and his family was about to be destroyed. Therefore, Michael took the reins. That's a shift you can believe. Now, let's go back to Pulp Fiction and look at Jules Winfield. Jules is the only person in Pulp Fiction who genuinely changes. And I want to be careful about what I'm claiming because he doesn't reverse, he just shifts. Jules is not going to wake up tomorrow and become some like Baptist preacher. But the shift he has in his character is real and it's earned. If you look at what happened before it, a man came out of the bathroom with a hand cannon and he emptied 6 rounds at him from across a small room, but every one of the shots missed. Now remember what Jules says later, sitting in that booth with a gun in his face. I don't mean to shatter your ego, but this ain't the first time I've had a gun pointed at me. If you put that line of dialogue together with what we already know about his work and what we've watched him already do on screen, it's beyond question that this man has spent a very large portion of his life around firearms. He knows what's normal and what isn't. And what he just witnessed was so incredibly rare, such a freak occurrence, that it's not a crazy thought to call it a miracle. And here's the part I find truly fascinating. Jules doesn't actually argue that it was a miracle. He never disputes the physics of the situation. He even says himself, the guy's gun was bigger than he was. Jules knows exactly what he saw, but what he says instead is that whether or not it was a miracle was actually insignificant. What matters is that he felt something, that God got involved or something got involved. And then he says those magic words, I can't go back to sleep. That's not a religious conversion. That's just a man being woken up. Like picture an adult seeing a sunrise for the first time in their life. And then we have immediate proof that there's a shift and not a reversal. Because it's all right there in the diner. You know, he recites Ezekiel again, The same words he said for years without ever really asking what the words meant. And this time he tries to work it out in real time. He starts out with, maybe I'm the righteous man and this guy's the evil one. Or maybe he's the righteous man and I'm the shepherd and it's the world that's evil and selfish.
Yeah, I'd like that. But that shit ain't the truth. The truth is, you're the weak, and I am the tyranny of evil men. But I'm trying, Ringo. I'm trying real hard to be the shepherd.
Trying to be one, not being one. He doesn't put the gun down and hug the guy. He keeps the briefcase because he has a duty to his boss. And if you think about it, he's not really sparing Ringo's life. He buys it for $1,500 out of his own wallet. Same negotiation, same toolkit, but a different outcome. He even has his own words for it. You happen to pull this shit while I'm in a transitional period. Transitional, not transformed. And to understand how big even that small shift is, well, look at the control group. Vincent Vega was standing there in the identical room at the identical moment, watching the identical 6 bullets miss, and he shrugs. It's the same event, 2 different men, and one can't go back to sleep, while the other one's just thinking about breakfast. And one last thing on this, because this really makes it land for me. I keep thinking about a scene from the movie Men of Honor. We have 2 men who grew up working a plow since they were children, and their hands are scarred the same way. They've got these deep crevices worn in from a lifetime of doing this really horrible backbreaking work. And that's kind of what Jules is up against. You know, the pistol isn't just in his hand, it's almost buried into him. You know, it's who he's been for his entire adult life, and maybe some time before that. That's why when he says, I'm trying, it's the only honest thing he could possibly say. You know, it's the alcoholic finally putting down the bottle. It's the gambler pushing the chips away. He's not cured, he's just trying. And that's what actual change looks like, you know, in the real world and in the world of Pulp Fiction. Same man, same skills, but at least he's on a new direction. Now, on to theme number 4, why there's always a king. So there's an economist named Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and he wrote a book called Democracy, the God That Failed. Now, before anyone gets excited, Hoppe, much like his friend and also mentor, the great Murray Rothbard, these 2 men were anarcho-capitalists. Now, these men didn't think a government should exist at all. So Hoppe isn't actually arguing for a king. What his main argument is that if you're stuck choosing between 2 bad options, then one of them is less destructive than the other. And whatever you make of the politics, he makes one argument that's extremely useful for how we engage this film. It comes down to something economists call time preference. So that's how much you value the future versus right now. And his point is this: a king owns the realm. It's his capital. It passes to his children. So he has every reason in the world to preserve its value, because burning it down means burning down his inheritance. Whereas if we look at a temporary official, like say a congressman or a president or something like that, well, they don't own anything. That person's just a caretaker with a very short window. And the rational move for this person is to extract whatever they can before that window closes. And then after, well, it's somebody else's problem. This is our owner versus caretaker. And that's really the whole distinction. And it explains something about this film I don't think really gets talked about. This brings us to Marcellus Wallace. So when we covered Goodfellas, you know, we looked at the whole crew, and it sort of operates in the way you'd have an organizational chart in a corporate boardroom. And there's a lot of overlap there. The business Marcellus runs is a model you'd find in companies all across America as well as the rest of the world. Have a look at what the film actually gives you. He has enforcers on staff. That would be Jules and Vincent. He has a club manager, which is Paul, who's running his nightclub. He has a fighter under contract, which is Butch. He has a wife, which is Mia, in this beautiful house, and he's got this fancy lifestyle. And he also has an outside consultant on retainer, which is Winston Wolfe, a man who manages to be on scene in only 9 minutes and 37 seconds, and he's handing out cash for damaged property. And that last one really matters more than people look at it, because gangs don't retain consultants, industries do. And Marcellus handles nothing personally until it lands on him. That's not a gang, that's an organizational chart. And this is where sociologist Sudhir Venkatesh, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly because this guy's quite brilliant, but this is when he comes in. So Venkatesh embedded himself in a crack dealing gang in Chicago back in the day. Most people know this gentleman's work through the book Freakonomics. Now what he found was that the structure of the gang was essentially identical to the business structure of a McDonald's franchise. There was a boss taking his cut off the top, there's regional officers, middle managers, and foot soldiers on the street earning below minimum wage for the most dangerous job in the entire operation. Because if you put any group of human beings together with something really valuable and a shortage of trust, well then they're going to build a hierarchy every single time. You know, it's not an accident that every civilization in history ends up with a king or something shaped like one. And even when nations or civilizations experiment with a republic or something like it, we'll just give it a couple hundred years, and the consolidation of power always seems to find its way back. Now, watch Marsellus and how he behaves inside that structure, because this is where Hans-Hermann Hoppe's theory really pays off. There's a corpse in Jimmy's garage. Jimmy is a civilian doing them a massive favor at 8 o'clock in the morning. And what happens? Wolf pulls out a roll of bills and he buys the man a new bedroom set because they ruined the linen that was a gift from his aunt and uncle. Marsellus doesn't have to do that. No one's gonna make him. It's not like Jimmy has some leverage over Marsellus or his organization. But an outfit that damages people and doesn't make them whole, well, it creates problems they're gonna be paying for later. Word's gonna get around town. And next time you need a garage at 8 in the morning, there's not gonna be one. It's not really generosity. It's a man thinking about the following year. Same with Butch. Butch took his money. He refused to go down in the 5th round of the fight. This cost him a fortune. And then Butch runs Marsellus over with a car. And what does Marsellus do? Well, after Butch saves him, he just has 2 conditions. Tell nobody and leave town. A caretaker takes the satisfaction because he's only thinking about the short term. An owner takes resolution and gets back to work because he's planning not only for today, but also for the future. Marsellus behaves like a man who owns this thing and expects to still own it in the next 10 years. That's not a thug protecting his ego. It's an owner protecting an asset. And 2 small details that tell you how the whole system is running. The first is Antoine and the window. So we never see this happen. We just hear about it. You know, you got these 2 employees standing in a hallway telling each other the story of what the boss did to a man who touched his wife's feet, and then arguing about where the actual line is. And that rumor is an actual enforcement mechanism. It's how the organization communicates company policy. Nobody has to send a memo about this. Everyone understands what's going on. And then the second is the phone call. So this is when Jules is on the phone with Marsellus. Jules scripts exactly what he wants his boss to say, and he says, "Tell me I ain't got no problems, tell me you're on it." And Marsellus says it back to him word for word. Now, you can only talk to the king like that if you're senior enough. That's not fear, it's chain of command. And here's the real answer to why he's the king. It's not just the brains, even though Marsellus has plenty of that. And it's not just because he manages people better than anyone in the movie. It's how he handles a crisis. It's how he handles pain. It's how he handles the worst day of his life. So what he does in that basement, because he does 2 things almost immediately, and both are the actions of a man who's still running his business. First, he doesn't kill Zed. He wounds him. He takes away the instrument, if you like, that he used to defile Marcellus's body. And that's not only revenge, because stories spread, much like Antoine, right? The fact that people are still talking about it is the entire point. So no one's ever going to know what Zed actually did to Marsellus in that room, but the town will talk about what Marsellus did to a man screaming in the pawn shop. And it kind of reminds me of Band of Brothers when we have, Lieutenant Ronald Spears of Easy Company. And there's the rumor that he shot a bunch of German prisoners of war in Normandy after D-Day. Now, whether this is true or not really stops mattering. The story itself does all the work, because men behave differently around a man that story is attached to. He isn't buying revenge, he's buying deterrence. And that deterrence only pays out over time, which is exactly the kind of investment an owner makes and a caretaker never bothers with. The king does what the king must, and everybody needs to know it. Second, when Marsellus is chatting with Butch after this all goes down, he lowers his gun and he gets back to work. Immediately. He's on to business with the man who ran him over with his own car, the man who he spent 2 days trying to have killed, and he settles it. And if you look at the economy of that conversation,
I mean, what now between me and you? Oh, that what now? I tell you what now between me and you. There is no me in you. Not no more. So we cool? Yeah, we cool. Two things. Don't tell nobody about this. This shit is between me, you, and Mr. Soon to be living the rest of his short-ass life in agonizing pain, rapist here. It ain't nobody else's business. Two, you leave town tonight, right now. And when you're gone, you stay gone, or you be gone. You lost all your LA privileges. Deal? Deal. Get your ass out of here.
That is a man running a negotiation from the inside of the worst experience of his life, while holding an entirely separate set of thoughts about the man bleeding on the floor. Calm on the outside, medieval on the inside, in the same frame. And here's the thing that ties it back to everything we've already talked about. He's the king, and the film still puts him in that basement. Why? Because he lost his cool. He got hit by a car, got up, and chased a man down a public street in broad daylight, firing his gun at him. He even shoots a bystander in the hip along the way. Now, if he'd stayed calm, if he'd made a phone call to his people, he probably would have had Butch picked up within a day or so, and none of this ever happens. So for 1 minute, the owner behaved like a caretaker. He took satisfaction instead of the resolution, and the consequence arrived the same way it arrives for everyone else in the film. King or no king. Now, Marsellus is the only character who is both the source of consequences and subject to them. He is functionally, in this movie, like the weather. Nobody comments on it. No one says a word about pride or hubris or how the mighty could fall. He just gets up, he deals with his problems, and he goes back to work. Not judging, just observing. So there they are. Those are our 4 themes, and let's look at how they stack. So we got consequence without judgment. That's the frame. So here's how the world works. Actions produce outcomes with total consistency, and no one ever tells you what to think about it. Attention and its outcomes is what the world punishes. Not evil, but absence. Vincent is a decent man who isn't in the room 4 times, and it costs him everything. People shift, they don't reverse. And then we see what it costs and what it rewards. Jules' character only moves a few degrees in terms of how he thinks and engages the world, and it took 6 shots out of a very large weapon to get him to see this straight. And then on to why there's always a king, which is why the entire structure exists in the first place. If you put people together with something valuable, then they're going to build a hierarchy, and then the hierarchy runs on exactly the same physics as everybody inside it. 4 themes, and not one of them's ever said out loud. No one delivers a lesson. No character explains what it all meant. There's no moment where the music swells and someone tells you the moral of the story. Instead, a man is out of the room 4 times, and then he dies. A man goes back for someone who wants him dead, and he gets to keep everything. A woman does one careless thing and comes within inches of dying, and the film never mentions it again. Once again, not judging, just observing. And that's show don't tell. That's show don't tell executed at the highest level of any movie. And that's why we're still talking about Pulp Fiction more than 30 years later. And one last thing, because it's really the perfect note to go out on. So 30 years on, we're still arguing about what's in that damn briefcase. And I'm sure you've heard the theory, about because there's a bandage on the back of Marcellus Wallace's neck that no one really ever explains. And there's a fan theory that says that since the back of the neck is supposedly where the soul leaves when it exits the body, the case, that the thing that has that golden reflection, apparently it has his soul. And these 2 men, Jules and Vincent, they've been sent to go get his soul back. Now, is that true? Who knows? Tarantino has said the case contains whatever you want it to contain. But that's not the point. The point is that the film left a hole exactly the right shape for people to fill it for the last 3 decades. Which, funnily enough, is the same trick one more time. Don't tell them, let them do the work. Anyway, that's it for me. My name is Eddie P. Thanks for listening. I will see you all next time.